the esteemed speaker, Rizwan Virk, and his talk is on the simulation hypothesis and the world's religions. A graduate of MIT and Stanford, Rizwan Virk is a successful entrepreneur, video game pioneer, film producer, venture capitalist, and computer scientist. He was the founder of Play Labs at MIT and is currently a PhD candidate at the College of Global Futures and faculty associate at the Fulton Schools of Engineering at Arizona State University. He is the best-selling author of books such as The Simulation Hypothesis and MIT Computer Scientist Shows Why AI, Quantum Physics, and Eastern Mysticisms Agree We Are in a Video Game. Rizwan Virk is currently also a venture partner at Griffin Gaming Partners, one of the largest video game VC funds in the world, and has invested in many successful startups. His startups have created software used by many of the Fortune 500 and video games played by millions, including Tapfish and games based on Game of Thrones, Star Trek, The Walking Dead, Grimm and Penny Dreadful. So I am going to hand it over to Rizwan.
Thank you, Rubaiyat. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to share my screen and share some slides as we go through today's presentation. And so today we're going to be talking about the simulation hypothesis and the world's religions. And actually, let me do that again and just make sure that I share sound in case we have time to play any video clips. All right, great. So we're going to shift gears a little bit here from DMT to video games and computer information science. And talk about how it relates to all of the world's religions, really, but some in particular. And it's interesting that I've had friends who have taken ayahuasca or smoked DMT say that they've actually seen the lines of the simulation, when they're high or when they're going through that experience. So that's always been an interesting overlap between these areas. So as I said, I'm going to start off with a little bit about what is the simulation hypothesis, why I think it can be a connecting principle across science and religion. And then I'm going to go into several examples, three major examples, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get through each of them. We're going to start off in India with Buddhism and Hinduism and talk about Maya, reincarnation, and karma. We'll then shift to talk about Islam and the simulation, with a few passages from the Quran and talk about the scroll of deeds. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Genesis in the Old Testament and the creation story there, and see if that might, if simulation theory and the idea of video games might help us understand something about what these guys have been telling us in metaphors. And then I'll try to wrap up with a bit of a summary and some shared vocabulary. All right, so let's start with what is the simulation hypothesis. And as Rubaiyat mentioned, this was the topic of one of my books called The Simulation Hypothesis. But the hypothesis is that we are inside a high resolution, high fidelity, highly interactive video game like that shown in the movie The Matrix, which many of you may have seen. And I first got stuck down this rabbit hole when I was playing a virtual reality ping pong game, and I have a little screenshot of the game in the middle there. And I had put on this virtual reality headset. It was about 6 years ago now. And I started playing this table tennis game. And at the time, the headsets were pretty big and bulky. And I mean, there was no way you could forget that you were in a headset because there were wires coming down from the ceiling. And yet the physics engine and responsiveness of this game was so realistic that for a moment, my body forgot that I was not playing a real ping pong game. So much so that I tried to put the paddle down on the table and I tried to lean against the table. And of course, there was no table because it was all virtual. And so what happened was that the the controller fell to the floor, and I almost fell over. And that's when I started to think about how long would it take us with our video game technology, which has kind of been my background in Silicon Valley. How long would it take us to create a video game that was so immersive and so realistic that we would be unable to distinguish the video game from physical reality? We would think we were in physical reality, just like Neo and Morpheus, and other people inside the Matrix did in that movie or that series of movies. And so, when I went out and started researching this idea that I called the simulation point, which is that theoretical point that we'll get there, I found out that there was something called the simulation argument, which was put forth by a guy named Nick Bostrom, who's a philosopher at Oxford. And we're not going to go into too much detail on this today, since our topic is more about the religious side. But the basic argument was that if any civilization ever got to that point where they could create these ultra realistic simulations, they would create lots of them. They might even create what are called ancestor simulations. So an ancestor simulation might be if we were creating a simulation of ancient Rome, for example, or of ancient India or ancient China, right? And he basically came to the conclusion that either no civilization can ever create these. Why? Maybe it's impossible to create these realistic simulations, or maybe they all destroy themselves before they can create them, or they would create lots and lots of simulations, which basically would mean that we are more likely inside a simulation already. And this is the argument that Elon Musk was referring to in 2016, where he said, if you look at the evolution of video games, 40 years ago, it was just a dot and two squares, the game of Pong, which was the first widely available video game. And today we have millions of players on MMORPGs. We have VR and AR. And he basically said the chances that we are in base reality, which means the chances that we are not inside a video game like simulation, is basically 1 in billions, which means that the chances that we are inside a video game is 99.9999%, right? Basically billions to 1. And so, this is where this topic crosses from Silicon Valley to a metaphysical question, which is that if somebody could make these simulations, we are probably already inside them. And it's looking increasingly likely that we'll be able to create realistic simulations like the Matrix within a few decades at least. And suppose you had a civilization that was millions of years older, which basically means we're most likely inside a video game already. Now, of course, I'm not really talking to you now, right? We are talking virtually. I'm talking to my computer, you are listening to your computer. So there's an element of virtuality that we've already built. But in this case, we're talking about the physical world itself being a kind of dynamically generated and rendered world, 3D world, if you will. Now, before we get to the religious side, I want to point out a distinction in the simulation hypothesis, which is that there's two versions or flavors. And I call these the NPC version versus the RPG version. Now, some of you may not know what the NPC terminology is, but probably your kids do, because NPC stands for non-player characters inside video games. So these are the AI characters, the characters that are not controlled by the player, but which are controlled by the computer. And a good example of that would be Agent Smith from the Matrix. In the RPG version, that stands for role-playing game. Now, in this version, the players exist outside of the game, and they're plugged into the game in such a way that they can't remember what was outside the game. And of course, if you remember in the Matrix, Neo and Morpheus and Trinity, all these guys existed inside the game as what's called an avatar, but they also existed outside the game. And so they were existing on multiple levels at once. And the RPG version is actually what's closest to what the various world religions have been telling us. And in fact, it's going to provide us a new way to understand these old metaphors. So first of all, I'd like to say that the simulation hypothesis is not just an interesting metaphor to talk about various religions, it's actually a connective metaphor that links science to religion. Now, what happened in the Western world 500 years ago, when the Catholic Church was ascendant, Galileo and others in the scientific community were prosecuted because that was the dominant paradigm. In 500 years, what's happened is science has become the dominant paradigm, and religion and this idea of mystical experiences has been pushed, outside And so scientists generally don't pay a lot of attention to anything that talks about a non-material world or anything outside the material world. But when you think of being inside a video game, suddenly many scientists and atheists are starting to realize that, hey, if we were inside a computer simulation, any being that was outside would look like a supernatural being to us. And so perhaps, being an atheist isn't such a smart move if the simulation really is a possibility. British philosopher David Pearce said the simulation argument was perhaps the first interesting argument for the existence of a creator in 2,000 years. And so that was an interesting statement. But then, as I mentioned earlier, all of the spiritual texts of the world typically come about when someone, a founder of the religion, a particular mystic, or a sage, peeks outside of the physical world, like peeking outside of Plato's cave, and comes back and tries to explain to the rest of us what is out there and what is really happening. But of course, the experience is ineffable in a way, which means that it can't be expressed in words. And so all of the texts basically use various metaphors, and I'll talk a little bit about those metaphors as we go today and why we need to update those metaphors given what we understand about computers, technology, and video games, and why the simulation hypothesis may be the best metaphor yet for what all these guys have been trying to tell us. So in a sense, I think of it as a connective thread across the mystical traditions, in all of these religions. And of course, we could delve into any one of these boxes, and you have many different sects, right? You have many different belief systems. And so today we're not going to talk about the differences. We're going to talk about what are all these guys saying that's in common. And so let me start with the first metaphor, right? From Rumi's Masnavi, which has been described as the Quran in Persian, right? And he uses the metaphor that the body is the clothing of the soul, right? And in a particular interpretation, they talk about how God commands that you go into a form, and then you do so, and then God commands you give up your forms, and they're released. You see a very similar metaphor being used in the Bhagavad Gita. As a person puts on new garments, gives up old ones, the soul similarly accepts new material bodies. So, this was an interesting metaphor that's been used across many different religions. But in the simulation hypothesis, particularly the RPG version, we have a new metaphor of what it means to become ensouled. Which is that there is a player that exists outside of the material world, and then there is an avatar that is our body within the physical world. From the avatar's perspective, everything looks real, but from the perspective of the player, they realize that it's a kind of mirage, a kind of illusion. But while you're playing the game, to really enjoy it, you have to forget what's outside. So you have to cross what the Greeks call the river of forgetfulness. And so this metaphor provides an alternate definition of ensoulment. Ensoulment happens at the moment when you get plugged in or when you put on the virtual reality headset and you forget what you were doing before and you think you are the avatar. And forget that you are playing a game. So with that initial metaphor out of the way, let's start in ancient India and look at some of the terminology around Maya, Leela, and Karma, and see if the simulation hypothesis can help us to understand this better. Maya, many of you would know this, is a Sanskrit word that means illusion, right? But if you look more closely at what different religious scholars have been saying, there's a more subtle meaning, that it's not just an illusion in the sense that it's not real, but it's almost a carefully crafted illusion. And you can think of, like, if you go to a magic show, the magician is not really sawing that woman's body in half, but you want to put your skepticism aside because you want to be wowed by the experience. And so that's the more subtle meaning of Maya, is that it is an illusion, or the Leela stands for the play, the divine play of life. That metaphor has been used quite a bit, came from the Vedas originally. Within Buddhism, it's a pretty strong metaphor to talk about the world as being an illusion or being a dream. And what's happened over time is that as technology and society have developed, we've started to use different metaphors. So Paramahansa Yogananda, who was one of the first Indian gurus to come to the West and make his home in the West, he came over from India to America in 1920 and had considerable impact through his book called Autobiography of a Yogi, particularly in the 60s and 70s during the counterculture. He updated the metaphor to say that life is like a movie projector, right? You think the actors are dying, the characters are dying, but the actors are not dead. And this came to him when he saw some newsreels of World War I at the theater and saw the vast scope of suffering. And he said, well, Lord, why do you allow such suffering? And he got back a clear answer that said, look again, what you're seeing is a play of chiaroscuro, which is an Italian word that talks about an art form that is light and shadow, that this is just light and shadow, and that the characters no more die here than the actors do in a movie. And so you can see that these metaphors can and should be updated over time. And that was a useful metaphor using the new technology during Yogananda's lifetime, which was a film. Of course, the dream is an ancient metaphor going back to the Hindu Vedas, and Vishnu is known as the dreaming god, and how the world is really the dream of Vishnu. It's also illustrated by an interesting story of Narada and Sushila. So the warrior Narada went to Vishnu and he wanted to understand Maya. And Vishnu said, you can't really understand it, but I'll show it to you. And so what he did was he asked Narada to go into this pool of water, and suddenly he became a little girl named Sushila, who was the daughter of a king, and he lived the entire life of Sushila, and he went through this entire process until there was a big war and her husband and her family all died, and then suddenly Vishnu appeared and pulled him out, and he said, now you might understand Maya, right? And so that was one of the stories that shows Maya, but you can think of an updated version of it, which is shown in a picture here, where it's like a virtual reality headset. Just like how I forgot that I was not really playing ping pong, you can easily forget yourself when the immersion becomes complete inside the video game. All right, let's talk a little bit about the wheel of samsara, right? Which talks about going from one life to the next, and karma, which drives the wheel itself. So if you think of this from a information point of view, my background is a computer scientist, right? We have basically the cycle of birth and death that's going on, and in between, there's some information that the whole thing relies on. And this information, I mean, depending on which particular religious tradition you're talking about, within Buddhism and Hinduism, it's a little bit different about, does the soul exist independently? But the idea is that there is some information that is used, and that information becomes the basis for karma, and the karma is the engine that drives the wheel, so that you have to keep incarnating, you have to keep taking on new characters, and you have to have situations in the video game which are related to the karma that was set up for you. Now, where is this karma stored, right? That's an open question. And in a sense, it's not visible in the physical world. It's stored somewhere else. Now, if we look at this from the point of view of a video game, there's an almost direct match. You almost don't have to use much of an analogy, right? We have this idea of base reality. You download into a body, you play the game, and at the end of the game, you upload, you then choose your next character, and you go back in. But there's also a whole bunch of information that is not in the rendered world. That information lives where? Well, in Silicon Valley, we say that information lives in the cloud, right? That's where all of this information is stored, which means it's outside the game, but it's actually there, and it's very relevant to what's happening in your life. Now, what happens in your life? Now, here's a diagram of karma as a questing engine. And the basic idea is that you have this database of tasks, which are based upon things that you have thought, beliefs you have held, and actions in previous lives. And within each life, you pull from this manifest of quests. And that's how video games work today. You have certain quests, and the quests have a difficulty level. And only when you complete one quest, sometimes can you go on to the next quest. Now, I won't get into the details of this diagram, but it shows that there could be an interesting information and technological basis for how things manifest and how situations manifest in the world around us. All right, so let's move from India to the Middle East and take a look at the Islamic traditions and look at the Quran and see what it might have to say that might also relate to the simulation hypothesis. So here's a quote from the Quran in Surah Al-Ankabut, where it talks about the life of the beginning, meaning the here, is nothing but a distraction and a game. Right? And the home of the end, the hereafter, is the real life. This is a very common theme, but I highlighted the words of distraction and a game, because it turns out that terminology is used more than once in the Quran. So you can look at another chapter in Surah Al-An'am, where it also says, the Quran says, but a sport, the world is nothing but a sport and a pastime. And now we're using the term hereafter as well. You can look at different translations of the Arabic words, and I did that just to be sure that we're getting the right, context. And others have translated it as a play and an amusement. But you can see that this idea that this whole thing is made up for us to have some kind of play is actually right there in the Quran. If you look at another surah, Al-Hadid, it talks about how the life of the world is merely sport and diversion and adornment, and an object of your boasting to one another, a rivalry and the multiplication of riches and children. And that absolutely reminded me of the game of life, which was a game that I used to play as a kid, where you have a character, you go through life, you get a job, you get married, you have kids, right? The adornment of riches, the rivalry of multiplication and children, like all the things that people do, right? And it ends with the life of this world is nothing but delusion. So again, we're seeing the similar terminology from the illusion or Maya from the Hindu traditions and Buddhist traditions. Now, as you continue in the Quran, it talks about something called recording angels. And this is a concept which is there in Christianity and Judaism as well. Here we see a picture of a recording angel. I believe it's the Archangel Michael, who is writing down names in the book of life. But in the Quran, they get a little more specific about these recording angels. They have a name. They're called the Kiramin Kitabin, Raqib and Atid. And what they do is they record everything that we do, right? In the Quran, it says, you have one on each of your shoulders, which of course is the origin of, the kind of the cartoon version of the good and bad angel. And the basic idea is that these angels are writing down all of your good deeds and all of your bad deeds in the scroll of deeds. Now, I believe it also means they're writing down your feelings and your intentions, as well as your actions. Of course, actions being the ones that give the most weight within the scroll of deeds. And so what is this scroll of deeds and what is it used for? Well, in the Quran, you also have this idea of Judgment Day or the Day of Resurrection, or El Qiyamah. And basically what happens is you open the books and you have to read your specific scroll of deeds, right? And it even says, not only do you have to read it, but your own self is sufficient as a reckoner against you this day. Now, of course, this is a metaphor, right? The Quran is not literally saying that there are 7 billion times 2, 14 billion angels sitting on our shoulders writing with a feather pen. If they were, like, what language would they write in? Arabic? Would they write in Chinese? Would they write in English? Right? It's a metaphor, but it's an interesting metaphor. And I believe that this metaphor, it's time to update this metaphor. And the way we can update it is by looking at near-death experiencers who have reported something called a life review. Now, I first learned about this through a gentleman named Daniel Brinkley. He was struck by lightning back in 1975, and he wrote a book about it called Saved by the Light, which was a huge bestseller in the 1990s. And, he had been in the military, and he had actually, shot and killed people in life. And he said he had to go through what he called a panoramic holographic life review, which meant he had to relive every single moment of his life, but he had to live it from the perspective of other people. And he said he would even see what happened to those people's lives. Like if he had shot a guy, he had to see what happened to their wife and their family. And this was, very similar to this idea that you are the actual judge. But in order to do that, I'm a computer scientist, and I say, okay, well, that means that everything would have to have been recorded. And of course, this is something that we do now in video games all the time, right? Through Twitch and through YouTube. The biggest, most popular content on YouTube is actually recordings of video games, right? And so you can not only play a video game, but you go back and you can rewatch the session. You can also say, this is what I did right, this is what I did wrong. And it turns out, a few years ago, I was involved in a startup where you could take what looked like a 3D game on a 2D screen and put on a virtual reality headset And this is pictures from a game called Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which is a game where you're like, it's a first-person shooter. So you're actually shooting people. But we could replay this entire scene from any XYZ coordinate. So you could literally see what it was like to shoot yourself. Now, we don't have this ability to have feelings inside the video games, but in the holographic panoramic life review, you see not only what happened, you see how the other person felt, right? It's like you take on, so it's a dynamic, three-dimensional replay of everything that happened. And I believe, the life review gives us the clue that says that the scroll of deeds is in fact the same thing as the life review, right? What people who have died through near-death experience have been reporting is similar to what the Quran has been telling us. And in a sense, it's similar to what we talk about when we talk about replaying of a game. You need to have that recording mechanism. So the whole physical world, you can point to any XYZ coordinate and you can replay it. And so that gives us a new way to understand, what these ancient texts have been talking about. Okay, let's go on to, or stay in the Middle East, but let's talk about the Bible and the creation story across the Bible, the Old Testament, as well as in the Quran, and see if there's anything there that relates to, what we're doing today with building video games and AI. And of course, Genesis is not only is the Bible probably the most, read book in the world, but Genesis is probably the most read chapter in the world, at least in English, certainly. Here you can see some of the verses of Genesis. I've highlighted a couple of the ones that we all know, even if you're not Christian or if you're not Jewish. One is God said, "Let there be light," in verse 3. There's also this idea that God created waters. First, he created a vault or a firmament. Then he created waters and created the dry land, earth. Then he said, "Let's bring forth vegetation," right? And then God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creatures." And then he made the beasts. And then eventually he created, humans based upon his own image. So a well-known story. And so much so that, it's been illustrated using video game technology. Here on the left, you can see from a particular Christian site where they are showing you using video game methods how you would create, go through these different days. So the method and sequence, the sequence was 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rested. And so here you have the sequence that I just talked about. And what is the method? In this case, the method is God speaks, and these things automatically happen, right? The world gets created. Now, if you look at the creation story in the Quran, it's very similar. It talks about Allah having created the heavens and earth in 6 days. And then it doesn't go into as much detail in terms of what was created when, but the basic structure is very similar, right? It brought the world and the water and then the pastures and the mountains and then the livestock, and then he creates humans as well. So we see the same sequence going on and on. Now, we don't know how this is done because it's all divine. It's all magic. It's not something that we can understand. But with the way that technology is developing today, we can start to understand it a little bit better when we think about not just present, but future video game technology. So here's a picture from the TV show Star Trek: The Next Generation of something called the holodeck. And in the holodeck, members of the Starship Enterprise could basically create any world. All they would have to do is speak and say, "Computer, create a world. Now create some trees. Now create more trees. Now add some characters and make them look human or make them look Vulcan or make them look Klingon," right? And so this is like a long-term goal for people in the video game industry, is creating a world simply by speaking it. And in fact, with recent trends in generative AI, which I'm sure you guys have heard of, between ChatGPT, Midjourney, DALL-E, which creates images based upon short statements of text or even long statements of text. Turns out we now have the ability to create rudimentary worlds, but worlds pretty quickly. So here is something called BuilderBot from Meta, where basically you can speak and it'll create these worlds for you as you speak. I'm going to play just a very short clip here. I won't go too long because we're running short on time.
Hey, BuilderBot. First, let's start with the scene. Let's go to a park. Actually, let's go to the beach. Pretty good. Let's add some clouds. Huh, that's all AI generated. Actually, let's add some alto cumulus clouds.
Okay, let me skip past that. But basically, now what you saw there was very primitive graphics. But this is old technology. This is from a couple of years ago, and that was Mark Zuckerberg. Now, I'm not implying that Mark Zuckerberg is like God, but what I am saying is that with AI, we now have the ability to speak into existence entire virtual worlds. And the resolution of those and the photorealism is getting better and better. On the left here, we see animals created by AI from the company NVIDIA using 3D models. So we're getting closer and closer to this point where we will be able to create worlds simply by speaking them. So we now have a way to understand what seemed to be something that's just simply ununderstandable, which is the creation of a world, if we look at this entire story from the lens of being inside a simulation. Now, one of the objections that scientists always have to the creation story is, come on, the world wasn't created in 6 days. We know that, right? But within a simulation, time is based on the clock speed of the simulation. I won't go into a lot of details here, but the term day or yom in Arabic, which was used, could also mean a period. And it even says in the Quran that what is a day to God is like 50,000 years to us, or some large number, right? So 6 or the number 7, these numbers are often used to imply many, as opposed to being specific descriptions of it. And so we see this idea that whatever happened had to be translated into something we could understand, and we can understand days, which are time within the simulation. So anyway, that is basically all the examples that I'll go into. So let's step back and say, if we look at all the metaphors and all the stories that all the world's religions have been telling us, we see that you can use different terminology to try to understand this idea that we live inside a world that is an illusion. God would be like a simulator or a creator. Angels who have no free will could be more like agents or super users that are recording everything that gets done, AI. The soul and the body translates into players who then inhabit avatars. The temporary world, which is the here, is like the game world. And the permanent world, which is the hereafter, is heaven, hell, etc., is base reality in this case. The scroll of deeds is really just a recording of what is happening in our three-dimensional world. Reincarnation is just putting on another avatar body. And then we didn't have time to get into the 7 Earths and the multiverse, but that's a whole nother story. That is quite interesting when you get into cosmology. So I'll leave it at that, since I think we are almost at time, but I think we do have a few minutes for some questions.
Yes, absolutely. First, let me tell you that was fascinating. Thank you so much. I have a question that I want to ask, but maybe I can welcome the audience first to see if they have any questions. So we're also giving the audience the opportunity to send us written questions in text, which I then can share with you. And if you'd like to answer, I'm going to relay the answer back to them in written form. Again, thank you so much. This was supremely fascinating. It was wonderful. And again, it's another stunning talk. And I know that the audience is taking it all in. I had a quick question. So when we think of video games, I couldn't help but wonder about glitches. And so what would that be in the simulation that we are in?
Yeah, absolutely. So, all software has glitches, and the term, a glitch in the Matrix was introduced in the movie The Matrix, where he saw a cat go across the door, and then he saw the same cat go across the same door or the open door threshold again. And so it was like replaying. And so a lot of the glitches in the simulation are these things that can't be explained by ordinary means. And so, whether you're talking about synchronicity, which is an acausal connection, according to Jung, or the way we like to talk about it today is a meaningful coincidence. And the point is, you can't necessarily explain that, but if there's information behind it, then it becomes explainable. So, like, for example, the other day I was shopping for a backpack on my laptop, and then when I was on my phone on Facebook, I saw an ad for that exact backpack. Now, if I didn't know that there was an information database that is tracking everything that happens, and it is linking those two, to me, that would look like magic, right? It would look like a glitch. But when you put on a lens of simulation theory, you can start to understand these glitches. And another one is the Mandela effect, right? Which is when a group of people remember history happening differently. Was named after when a group of people remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 80s, when in fact he did not, right? He actually was released from prison, became president of South Africa in the 1990s, and then won the Nobel Peace Prize and died, I think, in 2013. And yet people had these very detailed memories. And so the Mandela effect is usually tossed off, like many other glitches, like spoon bending, right? Like all types of paranormal phenomena, whether it's ghosts, but adopting this idea that video game gives you a way to explain, how things can be rendered and then suddenly unrendered. UFOs, there's stories of UFOs that just appear out of nowhere, and then they're moving around as if they're a hologram, and they'll go through physical buildings. All that sounds absurd, right? When people are trying to talk about physical. Now, it doesn't mean that the physical world isn't real, but if you've ever played a video game, you realize there are times when you're rendering that you can go through walls. And then when the rendering is complete, you can no longer go through the wall, right? And so that gets back to the cities, different abilities that, many yogis and sages and saints have shown, levitating saints, bilocating saints, all types of interesting stories. So it's a whole topic in and of itself, is glitches in the video game of life.
Right. I had another quick question. So I saw how you described friend lists as soul families. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that sort of how you would interpret soul families.
Yeah. So the idea there is when you play a video game, there's what you can see, and then there's what you can't see. And what you can't see are all the things that are rendered maybe on your screen, just like in Zoom, right? If you just look at my picture, you can't see the writing in the chat. It's there, but it doesn't look like it's part of the world. But in fact, it's behind the world. And so in the same way in a video game, you're walking around, you can send messages to your friends who are not in the physical. Let's say you're in a field fighting a dragon, right? You can send an instant message to somebody that's elsewhere in the game, right? And you can receive a message back. And so, that idea of the people with whom it's easier for you to do that with would be your friends list. And that's a very common terminology within video games. And so you have to add somebody to your friends list typically to be able to figure out where they are. And so, there are instances of people remembering pre-birth memories, of people talking about how they have been reincarnated with the same people again and again, in different roles. And so that to me would be the equivalent of a soul family or a friends list, which would be different from the particular family that you're in this life, in your current body or avatar.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think Johnny Allison has a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I had a question about something else, and I hope it's not off on a tangent here, but I guess you're familiar, Rizwan, with Clee Irwin's work at quantum gravity. You're familiar with that?
Yeah, I'm somewhat familiar with it. Clee and I have talked a few times, and so I'm sort of familiar with it, but I don't know all the details. But yeah.
I think his idea that it's something like we're simulation, but it's something that we're getting from the future, and it loops back on itself. So as we evolve, our evolved selves are actually creating what we are now.
Right, and that's quite an interesting idea. And one of the things that I talk about in my second simulation book, which is called The Simulated Multiverse, and that's actually when Clee, after reading that, Clee actually contacted me because he wanted to talk through. I talk about a computational model where if you're running a simulation, you never run it just once. right? You run it more than once so you can see what's going to happen. And in the book, I talk about Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer, who came to believe that there were multiple timelines, including the one from his book, which is now an Amazon series, The Man in the High Castle, where Germany and Japan won World War II and they split the US between them. And he came to believe that that was the timeline that ran for a period of time and stopped. And then they changed the variable. And now we're running a timeline where that's not happening, which doesn't mean that this timeline might also stop and they might rewind it. And we may not remember. But this whole idea of what does time mean if you're inside a simulation is a fascinating one, and it's quite confusing too, with our ordinary idea of what's in time. So yeah, I mean, I do find that a very interesting idea, that it's the future sending information back to the past, and that's an interesting interpretation of quantum mechanics as well. That the reason the probability wave collapses is because these possible futures are sending us. Probability just means, okay, these are all the things that might happen. Each of those is a possible future. One of those may be sending us back more information because it's a better state, So yeah, that's a very interesting topic as well.
Wonderful.
That's great. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rizwan. Again, it has been such an honor and a privilege. It was fascinating, and I know that I'm going to be watching the recorded talk many times, and I'll come back to you with a lot of questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.